There is a moment that many people describe in almost exactly the same way. It is not the funeral. It is not the phone call, or the hospital corridor, or the drive home in a car that suddenly feels too large. It is not any of the dramatic landmarks that other people can see and acknowledge. It is something smaller. It might be a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks later, when you reach for a second coffee cup and your hand stops halfway to the cabinet. It might be the moment you see something on the news and turn to say something, and there is no one there. It might be finding a note in a jacket pocket, or hearing a song in a shop, or arriving home and realizing that the sound of a key in the door used to mean something it no longer means. The large grief is terrible, but in some ways, it is the small grief that undoes people most quietly. These are the moments that arrive without warning, without ceremony, without anyone to witness them. They happen in kitchens and parking lots and at the pharmacy and while folding laundry. They are not dramatic, but they accumulate, one by one, into something that is very hard to describe to anyone who has not experienced it, the specific weight of a presence that is no longer there. We live in a time that is, in some ways, quite good at acknowledging grief. There are books about it, podcasts about it, therapy traditions devoted to it. People now generally understand that loss takes time, that it is not linear, that grief does not follow a neat schedule and ought not to be rushed. This is progress compared to an earlier era, when people were simply expected to compose themselves and carry on. But there is something about the loss of a long-term partner that still tends to fall outside most conversations about grief. Not entirely. There are memoirs, there are support groups, there are people who speak honestly about it. But in the wider culture, in the daily texture of how we talk to one another, this particular loss tends to be compressed. People offer sympathy, people offer casseroles, people offer the phrase "everything happens for a reason," or "he would have wanted you to be happy," or "at least you had so many good years together." And then the sympathy gradually withdraws, as it must, because life continues, and other people have their own lives to attend to. What tends not to get said, what tends not to get examined, is the specific nature of what has been lost. Not only a person, not only a companion, but something more structural, more interior, more difficult to name. That is what this episode is about. Not advice on grief, not a guide to moving forward, not a program of healing, but an honest attempt to understand what actually disappears when a long partnership ends, what a life built together actually contains, and what it costs when that life is suddenly reduced to one. Because the people who have been through this often describe a particular frustration. Not that others are unkind, but that others do not quite understand what was lost. And that gap, between the depth of the loss and the language available to describe it, can make one of life's hardest experiences even lonelier than it needs to be. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being misunderstood. From having something taken from you that other people do not fully see. That is the loneliness this episode is trying to address. And perhaps, if you have been through this, or if you are in the middle of it now, or if someone you love is carrying this weight, some part of what follows will feel like being a little less misunderstood. That would be enough. To understand what is lost when a long-term partner dies, it helps to understand what a long-term partnership actually builds. We tend to describe long relationships in emotional terms. Love, companionship, warmth, shared history, all of those things are true. But there is another layer underneath the emotional one. Something more practical, more architectural, that tends to go unexamined until it is gone. A long partnership is a system. It is a system for organizing time. A system for managing the cognitive load of daily life. A system for distributing decisions, handling logistics, holding memories, and maintaining a shared understanding of the world. Over years and decades, two people quietly and unconsciously divide this labor between them. They do not sit down and assign responsibilities. They do not draft a contract. But slowly, without either person fully noticing, a structure emerges. One person handles certain things. The other handles others. One person remembers the names of people at the annual gathering. The other remembers the medication schedule. One person knows which drawer the receipts are in. The other knows how to talk to the plumber. One person notices when the car needs attention. The other notices when a friend has gone quiet. None of this is dramatic. It is just the ordinary intelligence of a household that has been running for a long time. But it is also invisible until it stops. When a partner dies, this invisible structure collapses all at once. The surviving person is suddenly not just grieving. They are also managing an entire system alone for the first time in perhaps 30 or 40 years. A system they only partially understood, because the other half was being held by someone else. People describe this in different ways. Not knowing how to do things their partner always handled. Not knowing where things are kept. Not knowing what decisions need to be made, let alone how to make them. Discovering, often in moments of exhaustion and grief, that they have been quietly depending on another person's competence for decades without fully realizing it. And underneath this practical layer, there is another one. Something more intimate. Long partnerships create a private language. This is not a metaphor. It is literally true. People who have been together for many years develop a vocabulary of references, shorthand, looks, and codes that belong entirely to the two of them. A specific phrase that means something only they know. A glance that communicates without words. Jokes with no context outside the relationship. Names for things and people and habits that do not exist in any other conversation. This private language is one of the most intimate things two people can share. It is the product of time, of attention, of accumulated experience. It cannot be transferred to anyone else, because no one else was there for its construction. It cannot be explained, because its meaning lives in the shared history that built it. When a partner dies, that language dies with them. The surviving person is left holding half a vocabulary. Phrases that now have no one to say them to. References that will never again land with recognition. The things they would have said, and to whom, and the response they would have received, all of that is gone. And with it, a particular quality of being understood. There is also something that researchers sometimes call co-regulation. The largely unconscious way that two people who live together closely tend to stabilize each other's emotional and physiological states. They calibrate each other's mood. They notice when the other is tired, anxious, out of sorts. They absorb and distribute stress. They provide a biological steadiness that neither person would necessarily describe or even notice, but that both are quietly depending on. When that other person is gone, the remaining person is often left in a state of internal disorganization that goes beyond conscious grief. Something in the nervous system is no longer being steadied. Something that was maintaining a quiet equilibrium is no longer there. This does not have an easy name, but many people describe it. A feeling of being untethered, of free-floating anxiety, of not knowing where the floor is. And there is one more thing that a long partnership builds, perhaps the most difficult to lose. Witness. One of the things a long partnership provides is that someone else has been paying attention to your life. Someone else has watched you change, and stayed, and continued to find you worth knowing. Someone else carries the memory of who you were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the early nervous version of you, the version that no longer exists except in one other person's memory. When that person dies, something is lost that cannot be replaced or reconstructed. The private record of your own life, held in someone else's mind. The person who knew you before the gray hair, before the retirement, before the children grew up and moved away. The person who remembered what you were afraid of when you were young, and what you were proud of, and what you tried and failed and tried again. That record is gone, and no one else can restore it. This is not just grief for a person. It is grief for a version of yourself that only existed in relation to them. There is a tendency, when discussing grief, to focus on the emotional interior, the feelings, the sadness, the psychological process of adaptation. All of that matters enormously. But widowhood also carries a cascade of losses that are more external, more practical, more social, and that receive far less acknowledgement. Some of these losses are financial. For many people, particularly women, the death of a partner represents a significant reduction in income. Social Security survivor benefits help, but the household typically moves from two streams of income to one. Pension arrangements vary widely, and not always in favor of the surviving spouse. In couples where one partner had significantly higher earnings, or where retirement income was structured around two people rather than one, the financial change can be severe. The comfortable life they had planned together, the trips, the occasional extravagances, the ability to help the children or the grandchildren, may no longer be as available. This financial dimension rarely gets spoken about openly, because money and grief seem like uncomfortable companions. But the financial stress can dramatically complicate the grieving process, adding a layer of practical anxiety to an already overwhelming emotional experience. A person who is grieving deeply and also suddenly worried about whether they can afford the house is being asked to carry too many things at once. Some of the losses are social. Many long-term couples are embedded in a social world of other couples. They socialize together, travel together, attend events together, build friendships together. When one partner dies, the surviving person does not only lose their partner, they often, quietly and gradually, lose access to a social world that was organized around the couple as a unit. This is not usually deliberate. Other couples are not cruel. But there is a natural awkwardness that develops. The odd number at the dinner table. The way the conversation was built for two. The friendships that were really his friendships, or her friendships, held in common out of proximity but not always out of genuine individual connection. The couple's world was a shared creation, and without one half of the couple, it no longer coheres in the same way. Many widows and widowers describe a quiet withdrawal from social life in the months and years after a loss, not entirely chosen, not entirely imposed, but a gradual recognition that the social world they inhabited was built for a version of themselves that no longer exists. Some of the losses are practical in ways that catch people off guard. The decision-making is exhausting. In a long partnership, decisions are distributed. Major decisions are discussed. Minor decisions are delegated. There is always someone to ask, someone to check with, someone whose opinion matters and shapes the final outcome. Even in relationships where one person makes most of the decisions, the other person's presence is part of the process. The knowledge that someone else is aware of what is happening, that the decision is being witnessed. When that other person is gone, every decision must be made alone. Not only the large ones, the medical, the financial, the housing, but the small ones too. What to have for dinner. Whether to go to the event or stay home. Whether to spend the money or save it. Whether to call the child or wait for them to call. These small decisions, accumulated over a day, can become genuinely exhausting in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. The absence of a sounding board, even a silent one, is felt constantly. And then there is the particular loss of physical presence. People do not always talk about this, perhaps because it can seem too intimate, too private to discuss. But physical proximity, the warmth of another person in the same house, in the same bed, the simple fact of another body in a shared space, is something that goes very deep. For many people, sleeping alone after years of sharing a bed with the same person is one of the most visceral and disorienting aspects of early widowhood. It is not abstract. The body knows. The body registered this other person's presence for so long that its absence is physical. Touch, too, is something that many long-term partners provide for each other in ways that become habitual and unremarkable, and whose absence, once it is gone, is startling. The brief touch on the shoulder passing through a room. The hand on the arm during a difficult conversation. The particular comfort of a familiar body nearby. These things are easy to overlook when they are present. Their absence is hard to overlook. And beyond the physical, there is the loss of having someone to tell things to. This sounds simple, but it is not. Sharing the small daily events of a life, not the significant ones, but the mundane ones, the things that barely deserve to be called stories, is one of the quiet pleasures of a long companionship. Something funny happened at the pharmacy. There was an interesting program on the television. The neighbor's tree has finally bloomed. These are not important things. But they are the texture of a shared life, and telling them to someone who is interested, or at least attentive, is one of the ways that daily experience acquires meaning. When that person is gone, the small events of daily life lose a listener. They happen and then they dissolve, without being caught and held in conversation. The day passes, and there is no accounting of it at the end. Over time, this can contribute to a strange sense of unreality, the feeling that daily life is somehow less witnessed, less real, less anchored in shared experience. None of these things are simple grief. They are the structural consequences of removing a person who was woven into the fabric of an ordinary day. And because they do not fit neatly into the language of grief, they often go unnamed. The person living through them may not have words for what they are experiencing, which makes it harder to ask for what they need, and harder for others to offer it. There is a question that many people in long relationships carry quietly, and that tends to surface most sharply in widowhood. A question that is difficult to ask and harder to answer. Who am I, without this? Not who were we. Who am I? It is not a question that arises in short relationships or in relationships that ended by choice. It is particular to long partnerships, to the ones that lasted decades, that shaped the rhythms of daily life, that became the context in which a person's identity was constructed and maintained. Long partnerships change people. This is not controversial. Anyone who has been in one for a significant time understands intuitively that they are not the same person they were when they entered it. Their preferences have changed, some of them absorbed from the other person. Their habits have changed, adjusted to coexistence. Their sense of themselves has changed, shaped by years of being known and seen and responded to by the same pair of eyes. The philosopher might call this relational identity, the idea that who we are is never entirely fixed and internal, but is partly constituted by our relationships, our roles, our ongoing conversations with other people. We are, in part, who we are because of who is watching. This is not weakness. It is the natural condition of a genuinely shared life. But it means that when the partnership ends, when the other person is gone, the identity that was built within it does not remain fully intact. Part of it depended on the other person's presence. Part of it was held in place by them. Without that, the remaining person is left with a version of themselves that is suddenly less certain, less defined, less legible. Many widows and widowers describe a period of genuine confusion about their own preferences, not the large questions, but the small ones. What kind of food do I actually like, now that I am not eating for two? What kind of evenings do I prefer, when there is no one else to consider? What do I want to watch? What do I want to read? How do I want to use a Saturday morning? What do I find interesting? What makes me comfortable? What do I value? Some of these preferences had been formed so long ago in relation to another person that the person cannot now locate them on their own. And the absent partner does not simply disappear. This is something that tends to surprise people who have not experienced it. The partner is dead, the relationship is over, and yet, for many people, the influence of the partner continues to operate quietly in their daily life for years, sometimes for the rest of their life. They catch themselves choosing the brand the partner preferred, avoiding the food the partner disliked, taking the route the partner always took, even when there was no particular reason to, making the joke the partner would have made, to an audience that does not know why it is funny, defending a position the partner would have held, in a conversation the partner never knew existed. The partner's voice is still there, in some form. The partner's preferences are still shaping choices. The partner's habits are still in the body, the hands, the tongue. This is not pathological. It is simply the consequence of deep familiarity. 40 years of living alongside someone does not end cleanly. The other person becomes part of the interior furniture of the self. Their presence is so woven into expectation and habit and memory that their absence does not produce a blank. It produces a ghost. Not frightening, not supernatural, but real. The trace of a person in the patterns they left behind. Many people describe this not with fear but with something closer to gratitude, the recognition that the partner, in some sense, continues. That the relationship did not simply stop when the person died, but transformed into something quieter and less visible and harder to describe. But there is also a particular grief in this continuation. Because the partner who continues in this way cannot be updated, cannot be surprised, cannot grow. The person in memory is fixed at the point of death, or fixed at some idealized earlier version, and the surviving partner must do all the changing alone, without the conversation that would have accompanied it. The future was imagined together. The retirement trip, the grandchildren growing up, the old age that they were going to navigate side by side. That future does not disappear entirely. It becomes a kind of shadow future, the version that would have been, running alongside the version that actually unfolds. And the gap between those two futures is something that must be lived with, quietly, for a long time. What is particularly hard about this, and what tends to get the least acknowledgement, is that widowhood arrives, for most people, at exactly the wrong time. Not wrong in the sense that any time would be right, but wrong in the sense that by the time a long partnership ends in death, the surviving person is typically older, more tired, with fewer social resources, less flexibility, and a diminishing sense that they have the time or energy to begin anything again from scratch. Young people who lose partners have decades ahead to rebuild. They have the flexibility to change career, move city, enter a new relationship, construct an entirely different life from the one they were living. This is not easy for them. It is devastating. But the reconstruction is possible in a way that is different for someone who is 68 or 74. At that age, the social world is more fixed. The friends are fewer and some of them are gone. The body is less adaptable. The energy available for starting over is not the same. And the culture does not particularly encourage or support the idea of a person in their late 60s beginning again from the foundations. This does not mean that life after widowhood is simply diminishment. It does not mean that nothing good or new or meaningful can happen. But it means that the task of finding out who you are without the partner, and what life can mean without them, is a task that must be undertaken with whatever resources remain, in whatever time remains, without the luxury of youth's flexibility. And that is a genuinely hard thing to be asked to do. Harder, perhaps, than the culture fully acknowledges. There is no resolution to offer here. No program for getting through this. No sequence of steps that leads from grief to peace. No timeline by which the work of it should be finished. This is partly because there is no finishing. The partner who is gone does not return to settled memory as the years pass, the way a peripheral loss might. They continue to live in the structure of the surviving person's daily life, in the habits, the preferences, the patterns of thought, the ongoing conversation with someone who is no longer there to answer. This does not stop. It changes shape over time, but it does not stop. What tends to happen, for many people, is something quieter and more gradual than healing. They learn to carry it. That may sound like a modest outcome, and in some ways it is. It does not look like happiness or resolution, or the triumphant narrative of a person who suffered and then recovered and is now better for the experience. It looks more like someone who has learned to move through a day with a weight that is always present, but that they have come to know well enough that it no longer unbalances them. The vocabulary of grief often reaches for healing, for the wound that closes, the pain that recedes, the return to some prior state of wholeness. But widowhood after a long partnership is not really that. The person who existed before the partnership is not waiting somewhere to be restored. That person was changed by the relationship and is not available to return to. What is available, eventually, is a different version of the self. One that has been shaped by both the partnership and the loss of it. One that carries the other person in some form, not as an open wound, but as a presence. Not as absence, exactly, but as an altered sense of what presence means. Many people who have been through this describe, years later, a quality of life that is quieter and more deliberate than what came before. Not smaller, exactly, though the social world may have contracted. Not sadder, exactly, though the sadness is still there. But more considered. more attentive to what actually matters, less interested in the noise of things that do not matter. This is not compensation. It does not balance the scales. It does not make the loss worthwhile. But it is real, and it is worth noticing. There is also something that tends to happen with the absent partner over time. They do not fade in the way that less intimate relationships fade. They become, instead, a kind of internal companion, a perspective that the surviving person carries, a voice that speaks in the back of their mind, a standard against which things are quietly measured. Some people find this comforting. Some find it painful. Most find it both, simultaneously. The partner who is gone does not stay at the moment of death. In memory and in the interior life, they sometimes seem to grow, to become more fully known, even absent, than they were in life. There is a way of understanding another person that becomes available only in retrospect, only in the silence of their absence, when there is finally the time and the stillness to look back at what was there. Many widows and widowers speak of understanding their partner better in the years after their death than they did while they were alive. Not because they are idealizing them. The irritations and imperfections remain, and most people hold onto them with a kind of grateful accuracy. But because the relationship, seen whole from the outside of it, becomes visible in ways it was not from within. What made it work? What was genuinely good in it? What was left unresolved and will remain that way? What was offered and what was received? What was never said but was understood anyway? These things clarify in absence, the way a landscape becomes clearer from a distance than from inside it. And perhaps this is something worth sitting with. The loss of a long-term partner is one of the most disorienting experiences in human life. It is the loss of a person, yes. But it is also the loss of a language, a system, a witness, a version of yourself that only existed in relation to them. It is the loss of a future that was imagined together. It is the sudden, unasked for requirement to find out who you are in conditions you would never have chosen. The culture does not always give this loss the weight it deserves. The language available for it is thinner than the experience requires. The support on offer, though offered with genuine kindness, rarely reaches all the way into the specific strangeness of what has been taken. And so, if you are carrying this loss, what can be said honestly? Only this: that what you are doing is genuinely difficult. That what was taken from you was real and substantial and not replaceable. That the disorientation you feel is not weakness, but the entirely reasonable response to a significant internal loss. That there is no correct way to do this and no correct timeline for it. That the partner you lost is not gone in the way that ordinary absence is gone. They remain, in some form, and that remaining is not a problem to be solved. And that the person you are becoming, in the aftermath of this, is not a diminished version of the person you were. It is a different one, shaped by love and by loss in equal measure. That is not nothing. It is, perhaps, the quietest kind of continuity. The work of remaining is long, but it is still work that belongs to a life. And a life, even a quieter and more solitary one than was imagined, is still something worth tending to. With patience, with honesty, and without the expectation that it should look like anything other than what it is.